We know that we're going to exceed 1.5 degree warming now, even if everyone reduces their emissions extremely fast, reaches their net zero targets even quicker than they said they will. And the Earth is warming faster than kind of the models are saying, at least in the last year or so. So there is a lot of unknowns and a lot of risks when it comes to this very rapid warming. And people are going to die because of this. It's just a question of how many.
You're listening to Wicked Problems. I'm Richard Delevan.
Jan Wurzbacher, the co-CEO of Climeworks, said that his company could potentially get to the tens of millions of tons by 2050 if it only relied on the voluntary market, but it would only get to the billion-ton scale, the really meaningful scale for limiting climate change, if governments obliged companies to pay companies like his to take a certain amount of their emissions out of the air.
Carbon dioxide removals. We started this whole thing at Wicked Problems in part because we wanted to better sift through the claims versus reality of the tech. And we looked at the US government's carbon removals moonshot program to crash build tech that could remove carbon from ambient air for less than $100 a ton. And the X Prize, which may hopefully wind up being a more helpful contribution to human civilization than another decision by that same guy to buy Twitter. That prize to help fund the most promising tech pathways, and for which Undo is a finalist. Their CEO, Jim Mann, was one of our first guests on this show. And we've had others, including Karen Maisano from RMI, researching those pathways. So we're doing a couple of episodes to check in on the sector, the funders, the founders, the analysts, the refs keeping score. Like solar radiation management, aka geoengineering, the very idea of carbon removals raises hackles and fiery passions. For this episode, we've got two great guests, Robert Höglund, the polymath creator of, amongst other things, CDR.fyi, a website that tracks carbon removal contracts, and MilkyWire, a fund that's backing some of this tech. We even actually touched that third rail of climate tech, geoengineering, in our conversation. But 2 years ago, the Swiss-based direct air capture company Climeworks announced that they had raised a staggering $650 million to fund their expansion after a demo project in Iceland. This month, the company switched on Mammoth, a new facility in Iceland with 9 times the capacity of the pilot. Working with an Icelandic company, Carbfix, that takes the captured CO2 and turns it into, rock. Its capacity is just 36,000 tons per year, which is a drop in the ocean compared to the 50 billion tons plus of CO2 we're pumping out each year. But a lot rides on finding out quickly whether these technologies can scale quick enough and become cheap enough to help us, if not to stay below 1.5 degrees, which is basically toast, but to be part of how what our previous guest, climate scientist Andy Reisinger, describes as temporary overshoot. If we can be honest about not meeting the targets, we also need to be honest about using whatever tech we can to suck carbon out of the air and get back below 1.5 as quickly as possible. Friend of the show, Ben Cooke of the Times of London, went up to Iceland to be there for the big event. Climeworks turned that on, and we speak to him about that. If you're enjoying these conversations, do consider leaving us a rating and review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're hearing these episodes of Wicked Problems. And we'd really, and by we I mean also my wife, really, really appreciate it if you would go the extra mile and become a paying supporter of our work at wickedproblems.earth. Your generosity will enable us to keep going and keep bringing you exclusive insights from fabulous guests like Ben and Robert, and even bring in talented climate tech journalists who might join our little merry band. We're lining up guests for a future episode that will follow this one with some of the brightest thinkers and doers in carbon removal, including the founder and CEO of Vaulted Deep, which signed a massive contract with Frontier for carbon removals recently. Tell us more about that. For now, we hope you enjoy these conversations, and we start with Ben Cooke of The Times, with his terrific account of the Climeworks switch-on in Iceland last week. Welcoming back, returning champion, Ben Cooke, Earth editor of The Times. Welcome to Wicked Problems.
Hi there, Richard. Good to be.
So, thank you for coming. And Gus, it's after a few Scorchio days here in the UK, it's now a dreary day. But of course, you were in a far more glamorous location not too long ago, Ben, and you wrote that up in your paper. Tell us about your trip to Iceland.
Yeah, I was in Iceland to see Climeworks' new facility, Mammoth, which is about 20 miles outside of Reykjavik in this big valley where there's also a big geothermal power plant. Of course, not coincidentally, that's where they're getting their energy. And it's quite an atmospheric sort of place because there are these big vapor clouds coming from the geothermal plant, and it's in the shadow of a dormant volcano and so on. So, yeah, it was a very cool place to visit.
I bet they hope it's dormant anyway. Iceland,
yeah,
things do tend to wake up. But interesting. But yeah, I think that we talked a little bit about this, and we've talked about this before, and certainly we've on the show talked to people and written about this in the newsletter. You know, that the presence or absence of a plentiful, cheap source of electricity is the key for some of these things, and so it's something that causes some people to break out in a rash when people start talking about carbon dioxide removals, particularly DAC, because it's so energy intensive. And I mean, I guess just for the sake of, I mean, I think your piece in the Times on the 14th did a really good job of explaining in straightforward language, you know, how the technology actually works. So can you just remind us about this is going to capture, like you say, 36,000 tons of CO2 a year, but how does it do it?
So with these big fans, which are built all the way around the Climeworks facility, and these fans draw in air. They draw it towards a sticky surface, which captures the carbon molecules. And then, having used electricity from the geothermal plant to turn those fans, the facility then uses geothermal heat to separate the carbon atoms from that sticky surface, collect them all in the facility, and then mix them with water to create basically fizzy water. And then Climeworks partner, an Icelandic startup called Carbfix, takes that water and pumps it underground into the solidified lava on which the facility is built. And then when it's underground, the carbon atoms in that water will start to attach themselves to the rock and form crystals. Right. And then the water is pumped up again.
No, I think again, it's one of these things that, you know, either in 50 years we'll look back and say this was an absolutely crazy idea, or this is the thing that actually, gosh, if we can only make it work at scale, then, you know, like that certainly would feel like it might be necessary coming up when we're looking at all the data just getting worse and worse in terms of emissions and the temperatures just going up and up. And you had a chance to talk to the founders and management there. One of the big challenges is getting to scale. I mean, it's barely a sector at this point, carbon removals in general and DAC in particular. And they have some pretty chunky goals of 1 million tons a year by 2030 and 1 billion tons a year by 2050. How realistic do you think those targets are based on what you were hearing there?
So they have a little bit of data with which to show that they're on track to scale up to 1 million tons by 2030 and 1 billion by 2020. Of course, that scale up will be dependent on a decline in the cost of their technology, and they have demonstrated that their technology is declining in cost. So without being specific about where they're at in terms of how many hundreds of dollars a ton, they did say that they found that every time they've doubled their carbon capture capacity, their cost has fallen by 10%, which compares to the rate of solar and wind, which is 15 to 20%.
Right.
But actually, that 10% learning rate would be enough, they say, to get them to $100 a ton by 2050, inflation adjusted. So yeah, they have some early numbers to show that they are making this industry a more feasible proposition, but there's still a lot more to prove. This facility is only 36,000 tons a year. They are working on a facility in America which will be taking 1 million tons out by 2030. Then, as you say, they do want to go up to the billion by 2050, which is a long shot. I would say,
or as we'd say, we used to say in the startup world, a big, hairy, audacious goal. And don't ask me if that's actually an acronym. I don't know, but it's basically it's something that I guess one of the things that, in addition to the getting down the cost curve, that they have to be able to figure out. And just to break down the cost part here, I mean, for a lot of these pilot kind of plants that are being, kind of now being turned on in California, the Occidental's working in one in Texas. There's the with 1.5 and Heirloom in California as part of a consortium. I think Climeworks is in that consortium as well. And I think the Climeworks one is going to be in Montana, if I'm not mistaken. So it's interesting that they're starting to kind of turn on some of these projects. I guess it's the storage that's partly, a big contributor to cost. There's this other massive deal that a crowd called Vaulted Deep, and we're going to be speaking to their CEO soon, did with Frontier, who bought a bunch of credits against their technology, which is slightly different. And they came in, that pricing looks like it comes in at $380 a ton already. So that, it's hopefully we'll see a lot of competition in terms of trying to knock down that cost curve sooner rather than later, because it'd be good to know whether this stuff will work. So, I mean, the other bet that I suppose they have to make in addition to cost is on policy, right, and support. And I think we were both sort of nervously joking before in the green room about what happens if Donald Trump wins. And he promises on day one to, essentially have the oil industry write a bunch of executive orders that shut down a lot of the climate policy of the Biden administration. He's said on day one he'll issue an executive order to stop all offshore wind development in the United States. It's pretty scary stuff, really, and it doesn't feel like a company like Climeworks, as well as they've done, is going to have a future if we have a huge policy swing. It's going to be difficult for them to find the money.
One of the things which has always interested me about the carbon removal industry is that, as far as I can see, it seems to be based on a fairly optimistic idea of how the regulatory environment will change as the climate warms. So Jan Wurzbacher, the co-CEO of Climeworks, said that his company could potentially get to the tens of millions of tons by 2050 if it only relied on the voluntary market, but it would only get to the billion-ton scale, the really meaningful scale for limiting climate change, if essentially governments obliged companies to pay companies like his to take a certain amount of their emissions out of the air. Now, we are seeing some early movements towards a few geographies creating regulations like that. I mean, both the EU and the UK are in the process of working out how to integrate carbon removal into their emissions trading schemes. Lots of parts of the world don't even have emissions trading schemes yet, right? Let alone working out how the hell you integrate a company selling carbon credits for several $100s a ton into markets that are pricing carbon at $50 or $60 a ton. I was really keen to ask Jan, what happens if there isn't this steady tightening of regulation in coming decades? And what if companies aren't obliged to be paying Climeworks and other carbon removal companies to be taking in some of their emissions? And basically, Jan didn't have an answer to that. He just said, it's not a question of if that regulation happens. It's a question of when, because as the climate impact really start to hit home, governments will inevitably be doing more about climate change. Now, that would be very nice if that were true, but in my darker moments, I can imagine that the reverse could happen, where basically as climate impacts worsen, the kind of state capacity to be working out how to solve it might actually decrease rather than increase, right?
I have to say, I mean, we put out a couple of episodes last week that we were calling Oil Fought the Law, because there is now this raft of both litigation and these climate superfund bills, is what they're called, in U.S. states. So Vermont passed it with veto-proof majorities, a bill that would basically cut through all the litigation and just hold directly to account using attribution science. Like you, Exxon, you, Shell, put X percent of all the stuff up in the atmosphere. We now calculate that's going to cost the state of Vermont blah, 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 billions to be able to fix the infrastructure from climate damage and from superstorms and whatever else. And so, we can now use event attribution on the other end to say, well, this event happened because of climate change, which you caused. So here's an invoice. Please pay by the 30th. Or, we will attach, liens to your assets and whatever else. If that genie gets out of the bottle, I mean, that could be a game changer. I mean, so I'll be very curious to see what happens. Like California, Maryland, New York, Massachusetts, all of them have similar legislation that's making their way through. If that does happen and it survives federal court challenges, then that could be where the money comes from. It'd be interesting to see what something like a carbon take-back obligation, winds up going on the table. And if the oil companies get scared enough that they decide, hey, you know what, maybe we should be paying for this stuff.
Yeah.
And maybe we should do it quickly before we get sued out of existence. So who knows?
Yes.
But there you go. That's a tip for the paper of record. That bill could go into law as soon as Friday. If the governor in Vermont probably won't veto it, or probably if he vetoes it, it'll go to another session in June. And if he doesn't, if he just sits there, does nothing, it'll go into law automatically by, I think, this Friday. So there you go. There's a helpful little tip for big brothers at the real newspaper. So look, finally, I think it was always interesting to see what reactions are to stories. What did people say after they saw your piece?
So I think lots of people were just interested to hear how it works, but quite a few specialists in the area were, I think rightly took me to task for not going into the question of what is the opportunity cost of scaling up direct air capture, using all that renewable energy to take carbon out of the air, when you could be making much larger carbon savings by using that renewable energy to decarbonize parts of the economy. Professor Joe Romm of the University of Pennsylvania got in touch to point out that for every ton of carbon you take out of the air with direct air capture, you could potentially be mitigating 10 to 20 tons by using that renewable energy to do other stuff, powering electric cars or whatever. I'm not an expert in these calculations, so I don't want to gainsay that, but I do think there is something to be said for the idea that carbon removal is something we know we're going to need. Now, carbon removal doesn't necessarily have to be direct air capture. There are other methods. Given that it is one method which might work, I think it's worth investing at least some resources into direct air capture now to give us a tool we know we will need, even if you could make larger, more immediate savings of carbon right now by using the energy you would be using for that to decarbonize other stuff. Just because, this technology could take decades to become mature. We don't want to get to a point. We've done quite a good job of decarbonizing the economy elsewhere, but we still don't have any tools to actually start to reverse climate change in the latter half of the century. I mean, people might say that's a bit of a utopian perspective, but I would like to hold on to it.
Well, I think that you and I are on the same page with that. I think that, we talked to former IPCC group head Andy Reisinger, a New Zealand-based climate scientist who, kind of raised the alarm last autumn and saying 1.5 is toast, y'all. So we need to be thinking about how to make the overshoot, as they call it, as temporary as possible. But the only way you do that is by having some method at scale of being able to reverse some of the stuff. And I understand why it gets people breaking out in hives if they think that it's going to deter mitigation or give more social license to fossil fuel extraction and burning. Unfortunately, I don't feel like we have a chance to not take them. Well, look, Ben, so great to see you again. Thanks for coming on, man.
Good to see you, Richard, and let's speak again soon.
That would be awesome. Thanks. You're always welcome. Great to see you, man. Speak again soon.
Speak soon.
So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll have my interview with Robert Höglund. So stay tuned.
Hey, here are some ads to help pay the bills. If you'd prefer a version without ads, subscribe to our member feed at wickedproblems.earth. A monthly subscription is cheaper than buying us a pint.
Welcome to Wicked Problems, Robert Höglund. My Swedish pronunciation, I hope you'll forgive, but thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks.
So listen, I'm a big fan of your work, both on your Substack at Marginal Carbon and also just the various bodies of work that you've put out since 2019 covering the space. It's one of these conversations where I'm a little bit jealous in the fact that you've achieved quite a lot in a short period of time in a topic that, frankly, a lot of people find baffling to get their head around, or are really kind of stuck in a particular predefined point of view about whether it's good or bad, as opposed to trying to ascertain certain facts. So we started this conversation online in talking about your piece that came out on Substack a few days ago in talking about a recent report, and the headline was, CDR is cheaper than you think. So over to you, just to take us through maybe that piece and basically what prompted you to write it.
Yes, and in particular, direct air capture in this case, because that was the subject of this other paper that looked at early direct air capture technologies that have been around for a while and did very extensive work in looking at how much could they decrease in cost and using some novel ways of looking at that, and came up with an average number of over $350, I think 370 or so, depending on different techs, would be the cost at a gigaton scale. So when you were removing 1 billion tons per year with these technologies, it wouldn't drop until more than around $350. And I don't think there's anything wrong at all with the analysis, and it's a great effort that the paper does. But what has happened in the direct air capture space, and also including other carbon removal methods, but DAC in specific here, is that the development on the startup side is extremely fast. And you have these DAC 1.0 that they started out with, and then 2.0 and now 3.0 sort of, where you have completely new approaches of how to do direct air capture, and a lot of that innovation makes it both cheaper on the energy consumption side and in some cases on the capex side as well. And we have companies today that claim that they can remove carbon at a lower cost than what this paper stated would be possible only at a gigaton scale. And if you look at projections, which are of course much harder to say anything about than direct air capture startups, think that they will be able to remove carbon at slightly above $120 per ton.
Right. And I suppose that $100 a ton has always been, or at least for the last couple of years, since this has really been a popular topic to discuss. Certainly when the U.S. Department of Energy set it as the kind of under as the target prize, to get to $100 a ton on average for these technologies, and the question is whether or not, that's going to be achievable at scale, achievable at a price that people are going to be willing to pay, and then ultimately who is going to be willing to pay. So, I mean, one of the things that makes you different from other people who are just commenting on this stuff is, of course, you have a position at a crowd called MilkyWire. First of all, what is that, and what do you do there?
MilkyWire is an impact platform to help companies solve their environmental issues when it comes to climate, for example, and put money into climate solutions to help take responsibility for their emissions and also for other environmental issues. So I've started this MilkyWire Climate Transformation Fund for MilkyWire, and have run it for 3 years now as the manager, where we support carbon removal and new nascent solutions there as an early buyer, similar to how Frontier does it, but also projects within emission reductions and nature restoration and protection. And there we mainly support NGOs with grants, but on the carbon removal side, it's kind of early pre-purchases to help kickstart the technology development and focused on the long-term impact. What do we think this will achieve to help reach global net zero, rather than kind of how much can we say we're certain that we got in the short term. And companies donate into that fund. So we have Klarna, Spotify, ING Bank, Mentimeter, Avanza, and others, that many of them taxing themselves using an internal carbon fee, and that generates a budget, and they put that into the fund, and we distribute it to different solutions. And we do an annual call for proposals, and this year we got 1,000 applications across these 3 pillars. So very busy right now on the assessment, and on the carbon removal it was about a quarter done more for carbon removal. And then we also asked about current costs and what they're willing to sell for. And quite a few DAC companies were applying. So we could see that many of them are asking prices that are, the median asking price of the ones that we sort of assess more deeply, which is 17 or so DAC companies, so it was $500. And there are those that can do much cheaper as well. And when a company is willing to say, this is the price we're asking, that's something else than this is my cost projection in 10 years or something, then you're willing to bind yourself to it. And it doesn't seem like they're subsidizing the cost with VC money, etc. either, at least not the capex and opex costs. So of course there's a lot of overhead costs, but the real capex opex cost of running the plant seems to have dropped quite significantly over the last year. We can see it on CDR.fyi, which I help run as well, where the known asking price for DAC also went down 43% of the transactions where it's reported. So it's Frontier and us and others.
Right. And so CDR.fyi, again, we've mentioned it on our newsletter and our show a number of times in the past, but it just to explain to the listeners, again, for the benefit of not everybody would be as familiar. So that is essentially a database of all publicly available that you've been able to compile, you and your team, of transactions when it comes to people who are purchasing durable carbon removal credits, based against future contracts. Is that about sum it up, or what else should I be talking about with that? What information could people get from it?
Correct. And now we're also expanding it, turning it into more of a website where people can also report data that they don't need to be public. You can report your cost, your prices, for example, in transactions without needing it to be published, but it can still inform the aggregates. And we're building it to really become this trusted data source. But I think it is already, but continue to be that and cover more and more of everything that happens in durable CDR, and be the kind of center point that both helps suppliers, but also purchasers and investors and academics to see what's going on. How is this durable CDR market developing? Where are people getting active? Who's selling? Who's pre-selling? Who's delivering? So we're investing a lot of time in doing that, and we're going to grow it quite a lot more as well, I think.
And I was having a play around with it this morning, which you might expect. It was fun to see what's inside one of these kind of data sources. And one of the fascinating things is when you look at the kind of purchased versus delivered in terms of the different technologies. If I just click on the link there to say, show me the list of most delivered versus most sold. And the technologies that are most delivered tend to be biochar, and the most sold in terms of gross units tend to be DAC, and to some extent some other ones. So, is that just a feature of the technology readiness level and where people have been able to actually, put those credits into work in the real world so far? Is that basically what it is?
Yes. It's not something that concerns me. It's natural that when you're doing something new, it takes a few years for you to build those facilities and then start delivering. Whereas biochar, there was a lot of existing biochar facilities, where the demand from the carbon removal market made them possible for them to scale up. And it's also much faster to order a pyrolysis unit and start producing biochar than it is to develop a whole new technology, basically.
No, of course, that's to be understood. I guess the other thing is, of course, when looking at the scale of the purchasers, there's Microsoft, and then there's sort of everybody else.
Yeah.
Microsoft at 4 million, and the next one down being about 400,000 or order.
Yeah, they got 60% of all volume.
Which is, I mean, I suppose I guess that kind of concentration is that, how should one read that? You read this stuff very carefully. Should I be concerned that Microsoft, if it changed leadership, might just turn off the tap for that money that's helping to drive innovation in this space? Or, is it just that others aren't quite there yet?
It's more that if others don't join Microsoft, we got more of a problem than if it's just Microsoft turning off the tap, really. If we're here and Microsoft continues, but others doesn't join, then there's no market for carbon removal. So the growth in buyers is encouraging, but it's from low numbers, and there's still just 6 companies that bought more than 100,000 tons. So it's still quite low volumes, and we do need to have that growth.
And I suppose it is because taking a step back, I mean, the question about durable carbon removals is, you can see if you're in a space where, like Microsoft, you are building a business with AI and data centers that is going to consume more and more electricity, that's going to contribute, unless you find ways to, ensure that you've got 24/7 green electrons powering those data centers. That's kind of hard to just guarantee all the time. That there's reputational reasons why you'd want to invest in both be seen to invest in these technologies, but also be purchasing these credits. Similar for airlines, and I see there's some of the bigger purchases among your list that you've got there, and CDR.fyi, some of the financials. But ultimately, the question is, because it's a public good, is whether or not governments will get into this game. And the U.S. last year became the first government, didn't they, to actually purchase credits from DAC as part of their expansion program supporting, what Occidental and Heirloom and others are doing in California.
Yes.
So is government going to wind up being the major buyer of these credits in future?
They have to, either directly or indirectly. So the support that the U.S. government have given through tax credit 45Q and also other grants and direct support through the DAC hubs, and now they're also going to actually purchase outright credits for 30 million or so as well. But that's a smaller thing. That's been extremely transformative and extremely important. And I think what the voluntary market can do is scale it up in the 2020s, get more ideas tested out, and sort of prepare for government scale up later on. And the 2020s is really a formative period for carbon removal, where we need to get more shots on target. We need to have more technologies tested out and de-risked and see if they work, so we don't fixate too quickly on something. But also we need to have it as a scale-up period and get to at least tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of tons removed per year by 2030. And the voluntary carbon market can achieve that. But then going to gigatons, billions of tons, it's government, either through making it mandatory to buy carbon removal for your last tons, or making it mandatory to reach net zero, or having an emission trading system, or outright buying it themselves through direct procurement financed, by the state budget. That's the way it's going to happen. So forcing companies to do it or do it, it's both are state interventions. So it's one way or another.
Right. And I suppose, the patchwork of different political systems around the world means you're probably going to wind up with a patchwork of different approaches, but ultimately it comes down to, as you say, in this decade, proving out, certain things. So to your mind, what are those kind of the top 3 things that you, as one of the keenest observers of this market, think that the people who are buying credits currently need to see to continue to support, the development in the space?
To a large extent, what we've been buying is projections and promises, and it's a different thing to build it at some significant scale than to try it out in a lab. And there's going to be surprises, and what we thought were viable ideas might turn out not to be, and other ideas might come in instead and look more kind of like the ones to pick. I think it will be a portfolio approach for carbon removal. There's so many different ways of doing it, and they'll fit different geographies, and have some are energy intensive, some use no energy basically. Others can generate energy but are biomass intensive, and there's going to be a mix. But we're going to have to start doing it in the real world at some scale, not a gigantic scale perhaps, but at least have a few megaton facilities that do that, and then try out a lot of other things at 1,000 tons or tens of 1,000 tons. And then you can see sort of what are the real costs when you're doing it at scale. What are some of the issues around workforce, around getting the permits, getting the necessary supply chain of all the parts that you need to do it, and how does the sort of basic science work in terms of MRV for some of the processes. Those are things I think that needs to be answered on the technology and sort of supply chain side.
And I suppose one of the things that makes your approach across these different kind of hats that you wear different is that most conversations around this topic, particularly in kind of tier one business media, and God forbid, in normal general mainstream media, is that they never get past the first principles of talking about, like, do we need it? Should we do it? What are the implications from an ethical standpoint if we're doing things that, in the minds of some, wind up actually deterring people from mitigating, from doing the things to reduce emissions in the first place. So I guess that to be what you're doing, you have to have accepted certain things. You tell me if I'm wrong. One being that this has to happen, because if we don't, we're not going to be able to either stay below a certain temperature threshold or come down, after we pass it, by using some means of sucking carbon essentially out of the air, to use a very scientific way of putting it. But you do wind up with these conversations very much inflected by, these shoulds, as opposed to whether we are or whether we could. So how do you navigate that? I mean, because again, within the space itself, most of these questions don't really get a lot of traction, because we're talking to people who already kind of agree with the basic premises that you need in order to say, we're going to at least explore this over the next few years and see if we can make a market of it. Make the technology scale, make the cost go down. But if you come across people who are kind of stuck on some of these arguments, how do you navigate that? In the shoulds.
That's a great question. I think we who work in this field probably need to remind ourselves to always state the basic things that we all take for granted when talking to each other. That carbon removal is not a replacement for emission reductions. Almost all fossil fuel use is going to need to stop. And it's just the last part, and then also to address historic emissions. If you say that, I think people get the right idea from the start and don't think that you're trying to do something that's instead of emission reductions, etc. So, but you get sick of saying the same thing all the time. So, but you probably need to when you're talking to the public. But I think that issue about if carbon removal can be used as a fig leaf or like as a way of delaying action, it's really can be used that way. But I think the solution to that is to ask people to be concrete. So what's your plan? How fast are you going to reduce your emissions? How much carbon removal are you going to use? Then that forces them to say that, oh, well, I'm not going to reduce emissions. I'm just going to use carbon removal in 2050, and I assume it's going to cost $20 per ton. Then you can say, okay, so your plan is absolutely not serious, and
right.
You have to go back to the drawing board. But if they say that, well, we're halving emissions by 2030, and then we think that these last 10% would need to be covered by carbon removal because there's few other options and it's cheaper than other things, then that's a different thing. And I wrote a paper with Carbon Gap on this issue about how to avoid carbon removal, delaying emission reductions, and having that kind of asking for concrete things and having separate targets for carbon removal and emission reductions in the short term are some of the most important solutions there.
And I wrote about that at the time, and I think I kind of snuck in and listened in on a webinar you were on. We discussed it with Carbon Gap, discussing that back in, I want to say September or October, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. So I don't have it in front of me, but I suppose one of the things that at that time it would have been in the ether is the optics of one of the biggest headline projects for this being, Occidental, who very clearly see this as, part of their license to operate. That it allows, both from telling their, old energy stakeholders that the enhanced oil recovery will allow, them to maintain a certain level of sustainability within the old oil business, because I'll be able to both, kind of use a carbon removal technique that also squeezes out the last few drops, from the Permian Basin, in 20 years' time, and allow me to keep selling oil. but also the more broader social license to operate and say, we can use this to say, look, we're not as bad as you think because we're also taking stuff out of the air. I mean, the optics of it, I think that's one of the reasons that give people pause who are outside of the space. If they look at Occidental or they look at other oil, kind of firms that are working in the space, providing funding in the space, where that becomes problematic. When I asked Jim Mann this question from Undo, the CEO of the enhanced weathering company, about whether or not it's problematic to be doing business with the oil sector, his very firm answer was no. No problem, because I know what I'm doing and I know what I'm telling people I'm doing, and I believe in our product and our service. But does it trouble you that because oil companies have this clear vested interest in and openly state it, like we need to use something like this to extend our license to operate? So when you say people say it's a fig leaf, I guess they kind of have a point, though, don't they, in terms of the optics?
Yeah, but there's a difference between optics and what are people actually planning to do, and you have to have serious plans, and then some things happen more on a governmental country level than on the individual company level. It's very likely that we'll use oil by 2050. It's just going to use a lot less of it, maybe 10% of current oil use or something. It might be for jet fuel for aviation, it might be plastics, it might be asphalt, other chemicals that are used. So there is maybe room for an oil company, right? And Occidental might want to be that oil company, for example. So even though the whole oil industry needs to shrink by, say, 90%, there's still need for oil companies, and it's hard then to ask them to be the ones that go to zero. It basically has to be the government that forces down the consumption of fossil fuels by cap and trade or carbon taxes, or where you need to mix in biofuels, or you need a carbon take-back obligation where you need to buy permanent carbon removal for each ton that you emit. So that's, I think, is the solution for it. And optics is one thing. You should criticize that when it happens, and you should always state that this is not a solution for all emissions. It's just for the last part. But yeah.
The take-back obligation has always fascinated me as a concept, because it's easy for a voter, a consumer, a citizen to understand. I'm old enough to be, when I grew up in New York State, I would take the plastic bottles and cans to the supermarket, and I'd be able to get 5 cents for each one of them popped into a machine. So that made sense. Like, okay, we have some stuff. We'd rather not have it on the roadway or on the beach. So therefore, I'll incentivize people to bring it back and get rid of it. And the store has an obligation to help facilitate the removal of that stuff. So I think at a basic level, like, people just kind of can understand that in some way. But how do you see that as a mechanism that by which I know it's not specifically your area of expertise, but as a means of actually helping to achieve that what could be really transformative in jump-starting the carbon removal market, as the acceptance of that principle of the take-back obligation.
No,
do you think it has legs?
I like the concept of the carbon take-back obligation, but to be clear, it wouldn't start with 100% right away. It would be like for every ton that, and it most often it's suggested to be the seller of the, I think, the fossil fuel that would be the one that has to buy permanent carbon removal. So it would apply to imports as well, and it's not just something that sort of would apply to one country's companies. And it would start at some percentage point going upwards later on too. And I think it's good. If you say it's 100% and you don't do anything else, then you could come up with a scenario where people continue to use fossil fuels and they buy the carbon take-back obligation. And since carbon removal became quite cheap, no one ever built out infrastructure needed for net zero steel with hydrogen, or the charging infrastructure for electric cars. Or you might have a kind of a market failure in a way where the optimal choice for these emissions weren't selected, because you early on said that it's the carbon take-back obligation that's the choice. Although economists might say that the most efficient solution will win. If carbon removal is cheaper than everything else, then that will win. But if electric cars or other things are cheaper, then people will stop buying oil because they have to pay for the carbon take-back obligation and instead go for the cheaper option. And so, like, theoretically, it should steer towards the optimal use. But I think when we talk about what carbon removal should be used for, it should be used where it's optimal. All emissions can go to zero without CDR. It's just going to be very inefficient or very expensive for some emissions. So you might be difficult for you to control it if you're a company buying from someone else, etc. So, but there is, strictly speaking, no emissions where it's impossible to reduce them to zero. It's just that, carbon removal might be the best option for some.
Right. And of course, then, and who pays for it? So if you're sitting in Guyana and you're saying that, like, great, I can now promise my voters that their standard of living is going to be significantly greater because we're going to unlock this natural gas reserve over here, or this oil reserve. It is a tough conversation to tell, your voters that, I'm sorry, you don't have that future anymore because we're just not going to pump this stuff out of the ground.
And you should never do that, for sure. Like, that's something that really gets me upset sometimes, where rich countries tell poorer countries that they can't use they have to reduce their emissions, while they have themselves many times higher emissions, and they would kind of not automatically then build a lot of energy inside the country, or like give them other revenues. So this kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater in a way, because we're caring about climate because we want to help people like not suffer, right? You don't want to keep them in poverty with that argument.
No, and I think it's something that becomes really complicated, even just talking about carbon removal. But there was another thing that you'd been kind of commented on, written about a little bit on LinkedIn, and I think it was linked perhaps to the recent discussions at the UN Environment Assembly around geoengineering. And there was, so if I can recap correctly, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but there was a proposal from Switzerland to establish some more formal studies in terms of what's called solar radiation management, or geoengineering, more popular parlance, and the idea being, let's look at different technologies and what effects they might have if we were to put sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to try to reduce the amount of sunlight hitting the Earth and thus cool us down a little bit. And then there was a kind of a tussle back and forth. But you kind of took the view on LinkedIn that we need a proper conversation around this, which seems, given how difficult it is to have conversations about any other aspect of climate. I'm wondering, from your point of view, what would a proper conversation around that look like?
Yeah, so I was sharing C.K. Housefather, a climate scientist, take on this, which is great. So you can go and read that. And what he urges for, and I've also done in the past, is to do more research on it and to, seriously discuss how it could look like, how it would work, what would be the optimal way of doing, for example, the solar radiation management or marine cloud brightening. But I think it's SRM that's talked about the most. And it's something that we're doing today at a large scale with the burning of fossil fuels. So when fossil fuels get cleaner, such as now the ban on sulfur in marine fuel, then that led to a drastic reduction in these particles, and then quite some drastic warming over the Atlantic Ocean because of this decreased deflection of sunlight. And I think it's 0.5 degrees even that's blocked off by these particles.
Some of the corridor, like I think I've seen those numbers as well. But I think when people start having a conversation and use words like geoengineering or SRM, they tend to go straight to images of some cabal of people who are sitting in a dark room somewhere deciding we're going to manipulate the climate from around it. Whereas, of course, the reality is we've been manipulating the climate for thousands of years. Just we haven't done it on purpose so far.
Yeah, and volcanoes do this as well. Mount Pinatubo, for example, very famously. And then it can, at quite a low cost, lower the temperature and very temporarily. So it's something that you can do to avoid the worst harms of warming. We know that we're going to exceed 1.5 degree warming now, even if everyone reduces their emissions extremely fast and reaches their net zero targets even quicker than they said they will. If we have full success in all those kind of targets, we're still going to hit that warming, and the Earth is warming faster than kind of the models are saying, at least in the last year or so. So there is a lot of unknowns and a lot of risks when it comes to this very rapid warming, and people are going to die because of this. It's just a question of how many and sort of how bad can it get. And carbon removal is not going to help in the short term, and emission reductions are not going to help in the short term. These people will, die from it. And if we can restore some of that deflection without having the harmful effects in the atmosphere, instead of have it in the stratosphere, and deflect some of that solar radiation and lower warming, that might be worth doing it, because it might save lives, millions of lives. And it would be very cynical to say that, well, you can't do this because it might deter emission reductions, because then you're saying that these people are worth sacrificing because we think that might help us reach this longer term target to save completely other people in the future.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with the trolley problem.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, it maybe to explain the trolley problem, because I guess this feels to me like the trolley problem writ large. So maybe you give me your take on the trolley problem, and maybe if it's relevant here.
Well, it's a philosophy 101 kind of a thing, right? For like you steer the trolley either to one person or it's going towards one person, but you can change the trolley so it's going to four persons, but you can change it so it hits one person instead. Right. Yeah.
But the main thing is, would you do it? Because again, you then become a moral actor in your intervention in deciding you're going to shift a burden from based on if you take a ethical point of view that says I must have the greatest good for the greatest number of people, therefore I'm going to shift this moving trolley from hitting four people to hitting one person. But in either case, someone's going to die, and you're now responsible for making a choice, whereas you just didn't pull the lever.
Well, geoengineering is not going to kill anyone. The direct risks are very low. So it's more about, let's say, you're steering the trolley away from one person into a different track where there's currently no one, but people think that there might be a decrease in the interest in braking technology because you didn't hit this one person now. So, but if we actually kill this one person, people are going to take braking technology seriously and invest in better brakes on the trolley. That's kind of, now I'm really pointing it out. But since we're using the metaphor, that would be the
No, absolutely. I think that, for those people who do have the counter argument on this stuff, I guess they would say that because we can't model accurately to potentially some of the effects from, say, sulfur dioxide injection, the monsoons might be affected. That might affect crop yields. It might, even if you could attribute that just down to the one singular, vector of the cause. So you could make the argument that by changing the weather patterns, you are in fact going to cause natural disasters to happen in one place where they wouldn't have before, whether it's drought or something else. So I guess that's the argument to say why we shouldn't go anywhere near this stuff, because it's just a moral hellscape of trying to figure out, but whereas if I just stand back and try to do mitigation, we're morally safe. I don't have to worry about these things. Is that kind of sum up why this debate has kind of been done in the shadows so far?
That is part of it. I think the main argument is that it would deter emission reductions, that people will feel like, oh, we have a tool now to handle climate, so we don't need to do anything about emission reductions, which of course then you continue to you built this wall, but you're still increasing the sea level behind it more and more. So you need to build the wall higher and higher, and then you have the termination shock, and all the water comes back. That's the risk, right? So it would be crazy. I think that's the main thing. This about that you can't change something because it might affect someone. I don't think that is. Philosophers would make kind of they would go down very hard on such an argument, and I don't think it holds, because everything that you do have. Like allowing cars kill some people, and has benefits in other ways, and anything that you do has that kind of effects. I don't think that would be kind of the main thing that, but the uncertainties are really, that's why you need research to understand it better.
Yeah. And I suppose that, and finally on that point, I guess the fact, again, if you're reading through this and don't really have the cognitive load to get, really into the technology or the potential implications, what you do know is that Saudi Arabia and the United States are the biggest proponents of, kind of funding research on this. And I suppose that's leads some people to be skeptical about the motives of some people who might be pushing for it, I guess.
Yeah, I hate this guilt by association. Like it's definitely.
I'm not putting you in that box, just to be really clear.
No, sure.
But I suppose it's the, when people see that, they go, oh, I get it.
Yeah,
But I guess that's for me. I think I follow where you are. The idea, if you don't have the facts, how can you have any kind of proper conversation? I guess it's a question of how you do the research in such a way that people can have confidence in the integrity of the results.
Yeah, well, a lot of things are people make their minds upon it based on kind of vibes and optics, and I think this is very much such an area.
No, I think that's one of the reasons we wanted to have you on the show, because Robert, you're one of the few people in the market who's taken the time to really, really understand this stuff, to really, really put the work in about compiling the data, and you're not just an observer; you're kind of a player in the market. Even on a Microsoft scale, but certainly you're helping to steer investments, in particular directions. So you care about, in a very real way, the results. So finally, one of the things before I let you go, Robert, the thing we do ask people who come on the show, and if you haven't had a chance to think about this, that's absolutely fine. But we often ask people if they could recommend things that have helped shape their point of view on climate tech, whether it be books or films or podcasts or LinkedIn follows or whatever. Was there anything that you might care to share?
Well, I think if you want to get a better understanding of CDR in detail, then there's something called a CDR primer on the one hand that goes into a lot of detail, and then you have the Open Air Collectives. This is CDR series, which I think it's almost 100 episodes now, really talking to founders and researchers in the space, and I think it's probably the most informative thing you could be engaging with if you want to understand the details of the carbon removal space. And if you want to understand geoengineering, there are a lot of good papers, and the two popular culture things are Ministry of the Future and then Termination Shock by Neil Stephenson. That goes into similar actually scenarios where India is the one deploying it in one case and is stopping it in the other.
Yes,
but yeah.
No, I love both books, and I think Neil Stephenson is obviously comes at this with a little more novelistic flair necessarily. Much as we love Kim Stanley Robinson. But look, that's super helpful. And Robert, where could people get more information to follow you and your work? Where should they best look?
My writing is mostly done on marginalcarbon.substack.com, but LinkedIn, Robert Höglund, and Twitter, just /Robert Höglund, are places where I post most of the things and most of the takes or opinions on this space.
Very good. Well, Robert Höglund, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. It's great to be on, and thanks for all the great questions.
Thanks to my guests, Robert Höglund and Ben Cooke. To play us out, a bit of Kitty Edwards, the Canadian singer-songwriter, in honor of my friend Patty, who worked with Kitty and just became a dad. Really ripe old age, and I won't even say it on this recording, how old he is. But with a bit of fair wind and following seas, the carbon removal folks might, just might, offer us a soft place to land. And thank you, Django, for providing that extra little ballast in the background there. Over to you, Theo.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delevan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delevan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.
again.